Okay, podcast number 3. I left you at the end of the second podcast thinking about 3 different areas. So, whether or not you were going to kind of explore ideas of materiality and economy, of technology, or of the archive. I think it's worth me just saying a little bit about technology. So, we were talking a little bit earlier on about David Harvey's work picking up on Horkheimer and on Adorno's ideas of kind of after Auschwitz, of after the war, of after the dropping of the atomic bomb, and I think it's worth sort of just tapping in a little bit deeper to some of these ideas. So, what you have from these philosophers at this point is the horror of thinking that everything regarding sort of Enlightenment thinking, this faith in science, this belief in human progress, in evolution, in betterment, that we as a human race are getting better over time, is utterly subverted. Because what you have through the Holocaust is Nazi Germany in particular using the weapons, if you like, of science. So using advanced bureaucracy, advanced technology to literally wipe out their opponents and to wipe out people that they were scapegoating as well. So it's not just the horror of what they've done, but it's the horror of how that they've done it, and almost this sense from the philosophers that they have been complicit in some way. So you may remember when I was talking last week about Jean-Francois Lyotard's concept surrounding the postmodern, this attack, if you like, that there needs to be, or distrust or skepticism surrounding what he termed meta-narratives. And we listed some of those meta-narratives that might include religion, might include Marxism, might even include narration. And the one that I think was perhaps most difficult for us to grasp was this idea of science. But I think seeing it in this light gets you to kind of understand why science is now, post-Holocaust, being viewed as philosophically suspect. Now, those are difficult concepts to sort of get your head around. They will be useful for you if you were drawing at any time on notions of the postmodern. So if you're using particularly postmodern techniques, genre clashing, filmmaking, do have a look at some of the very useful guides, and I would suggest that Beginning Postmodernism is a really useful book from the Manchester University Press series. It'll give you a really useful kind of insight into this. Okay, let's have a little look at a couple of clips. Let's start off then by thinking about the Red Genia clip, which is the name, it's the focus of the young girl, and I think you know immediately which aspect of the kind of the film we're focusing in on. So pause this podcast, have a little look. If you're using the video on demand, it's at approximately an hour and 24 minutes in from memory. So watch the clip, think about this use of music, think about the style, think about the use of camera angles as well in particular. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at that particular portion. One of the things that I think you might want to think about is the way in which she is apparently unscathed by the carnage that's going on around her. You might want to think about her in kind of metaphorical terms, in symbolic terms. She's almost like some sort of mythical Red Riding Hood that's kind of walking through the carnage. But as with all good fairy tales, you know, this has a very nasty ending. So you recall as well that Oscar sees her body with the exhumed bodies that are being burnt sort of later on in the narrative. So think about that. Think about the way in which she is kind of depicted at this point as well. The other scene that I want us to think about and compare, actually, it's useful doing this with a film sometimes, to take scenes that are not in the same sort of chronological banding, so they don't follow on from one another, because I think that the shower scene towards the end of the narrative, when the women are accidentally taken to Auschwitz, is again a very, very powerful scene. I wanted just to look at that. So if you could pause this again, and we'll come in and we'll talk a little bit about that shower scene. Okay, so hopefully you've been able to sort of watch that shower scene. It happens towards the end of the film. I should have given you the time it occurs, so apologies for that. I hope you weren't searching for it for too long. Um, but I think it's valuable to think about the genres that are being drawn on here. You know, seeing this in isolation, you know, one of the most famous shower scenes has got to be Psycho. You know, this threat, the naked woman, and here the camera angle is very particular. We're taken in with the women. We are one of the women. We stand on the outside though, looking through at eye level, looking through that door to the women inside. So think about how horror is configured in this clip. And if you run it on a little bit further, you'll see the condemned women actually who come from Hungary, who are taken straight to the gas chambers. So think about how, you know, that one sense of relief that we understand. You know, we have this knowledge of what those rooms were, what they were about, and you have a growing realization of the women as well, what they are about from the stories that are told through the film. So think about how, as a director, Spielberg is directly playing on our knowledge, on our understanding. And you might want to relate that back theoretically to the work we were doing last week from Hutchin about this idea of oscillation in particular. Okay, so thinking about the kind of the responses then to Schindler's List, whenever you have such a high-profile filmmaker making a film of this nature, there's bound to be quite a divided response. So this takes us back to the reader. So have a little look, particularly at Zizek. Zizek's a very, very important contemporary theorist, and you may be familiar with his work, The Desert of the Real, which responds to 9/11 as well. He tends to be quite a social analytical psychoanalytical sort of thinker as well, and you might see that sort of coming through in the work that's kind of been done here. It's very difficult, isn't it? If you think back to kind of Weissel's terms about this, you know, the need to talk, that silence is not an appropriate kind of response. But then you also have you know, a number of these kind of representations, difficult representations, perhaps comic book representations as well, and finding the right mode, if you like, to think about these kind of very serious ideas is very important. And there's a danger, isn't there, as well, that you have this kind of upbeat or trivialized Hollywood kind of ending, because for the majority of the Jews arriving at the prison camp in Auschwitz, you know, their final destination was the gas chambers. They weren't all rescued as the women were by Schindler. So, you know, Spielberg's taken a very deliberate choice. He doesn't shy away from the random killings that there are within the text, and I think perhaps this kind of purging of the ghetto, which is the kind of the middle section of the film, really is where he's dealing with a lot of this violence. But you might argue that this is not a film about Auschwitz. This is not a film actually about the prison camps. This is a film about Schindler and the people he saved and the people kind of around him as well. So it's never an easy thing to sort of critique a Holocaust film of this nature, but just think through some of the various other representations that you can think of. Maybe the boy with sort of striped pajamas, and think about the sort of the childlike response and narration there too, or the book thief, which is perhaps a more relevant and up to. So if you haven't done so already, I want you to read through the reader, like I was saying, looking at those kind of reviews there in particular. And I think it's valuable to think about this term kind of post-memory. So, you know, who has the authority to write about an event? Is it those people who have directly experienced that event? Because actually for a number of cases that wouldn't be the norm. You know, creative writers really do draw on the resonances from across society, from global news, to kind of find their kind of inspiration. But there's such a degree of authenticity that is bound up with events of this nature. So you may be aware of the scandal surrounding a book called Fragments that came out in the 1980s that was actually drawn out from kind of repressed memory theory, and ultimately despite the fact it was lauded at the time for being a phenomenal text, was then found to be inauthentic. So this survivor, so-called survivor, had not survived. So there's some interesting areas there that you might want to sort of look at in particular. So this idea of trauma, so trauma theory, whether or not time heals, therapy heals, whether or not that the children, relatives, after the event, or even that this permeates the consciousness of society, that there's a communal feeling beyond that kind of first generation as well. So it renegotiates, I think, our position with history, with memory, with storytelling, with authenticity. I think one of the best tellings actually is Jonathan Safran Foer's book that examines 9/11. There's a section in there with the grandfather who actually then re-examines his experience of the prison camps. So really interesting kind of renegotiation, if you like, of trauma and memory and those kind of theories in those kind being developed through writing. If you haven't read Jonathan Safran Foer, he's a very tricksy postmodernist writer actually, but dealing with some very particular trauma. Hirsch's theoretical position, Hirsch is actually the person who coined this idea then of sort of post-memory. I suppose part of it is almost this idea of the empty archive, that these cultural archives are being systematically destroyed, eradicated, that people's lives, people's histories are being rewritten. Think about the way in which Schindler inherits that house, at the beginning of the film. There's no sense there of sort of ownership or possession in those sorts of, in those senses. But conversely, because of the way in which the Nazis sort of went about this displacement of people, what you do have, and I think the film does this quite well, is this archive of people's belongings, of people's possessions, of their photographs, of records actually. Eichmann is the sort of the figure within sort of Nazi Germany. It's very often held up as being this kind of hyper bureaucrat who would use, all these records of the kind of the final solution. So funnily enough, a really good book, if you've not come across it before, is Robert Harris's Fatherland, which is a counter-historical, counterfactual narrative. It proposes that Hitler won the war and that there is a greater Germany. It's a detective story which then starts to uncover the Holocaust. It's really, really interesting and very good summer read if you're interested in that sort of thing as well. So by having these kind of displaced archives, these photographs, these kind of museum pieces really that have kind of just been left and sort of stranded, there is this kind of trauma. So families searching for their relatives perhaps find these archives of materials belonging to other families. So there is this displacement idea, and also that the kind of the descendants then are both struggling with the loss of information, but also too much information, the loss of possessions, but actually too many possessions as well. So I think I'm going to end on this beautiful image actually from the film, and I just want this sort of poignancy of this image to kind of wash over you, and for you to think about these kind of people and this idea, I suppose, of these piles of personal memories and forgotten memories. Some of the most valuable things that you can take with you when you leave a house, everyone sort of says, is they go back in for the dog, but they also go back in, for the photographs and those kind of mementos. And I think it's a very powerful image from the film. So thanks for your patience. I'm sorry I couldn't see you in person this week. Any questions, please do email me, please do come along to the office hours. I'll be having a look at your film choices tonight and then meeting with the technician tomorrow morning to learn how to use the technology and also to agree our films. So I'm looking forward to it.